reacting to NFL Week 4, some of the major highlights, some of the major lowlights, unfortunately, and what we can make of those moving forward for fantasy football in the 2024 season. There was a lot of different bits and pieces, Shawn, around the league for a variety of reasons. They've changed some of the outcomes of some of these games. We had some injuries, unfortunately. We might touch on some of them as we go through today's show. But one of the things that I think we'll kick off with is Sunday Night Football. I thought that there was quite a lot of interesting stuff maybe in this game. We talked a little bit last week about, Lamar Jackson and the passing offense and how this team might look going forward. Well, the passing offense is, been very efficient, but not been used all that often so far. The part that we have to highlight, I think, is how the running backs are doing, and particularly Derrick Henry. We're also seeing Lamar Jackson, although is a quarterback, getting a lot of that rushing work as well. He has 2 passing touchdowns in this game, just the 18 pass attempts, so 13 of 18. We do get 6 targets and 6 of those completions going to Justice Hill. So that leaves 12 targets. And then if we're looking at other completions, we're down to just the 7 other completions throughout the rest of the game. Hill, 6 targets, 6 receptions, 78 yards and a touchdown. Outside of that, the next highest target is Derrick Henry, 3 targets, 3 receptions, 10 for 1 touchdown. Gets that short rushing touchdown. The next highest, Shawn, tied with Henry, is Nelson Agholor, 2 for 10. We got 1 target from Mark Andrews, which he dropped, 0 receptions. We get Likely with 2 targets, 1 reception, 26 yards. So the passing game at the moment is pretty much non-existent outside of the running backs, and it doesn't need to really be existent because they are being so dominant up front. And when you've Derrick Henry, 24 attempts, 199 yards, 1 touchdown, an 87-yard rushing touchdown, Shawn, in this one, you get him out there in the all-black uniform for the Baltimore Ravens. And, we talk about breakaway speed, running to daylight. This is a dude who's been in the NFL now for a long time. And when he was never getting caught on this run. It looked like he may not even have been going at his, 100% output. But Derrick Henry over the last 2 weeks has been incredible to watch. One of the, I think one of the most fun players to see so far this season. So he is truly dominating. We get a rushing touchdown and 54 yards on 6 attempts from Lamar Jackson as well. I thought Justice Hill looked fantastic on the receiving work that he got in this game. And they basically put the Baltimore Ravens into a 21-7 or 21-3 hole at halftime, and they really struggled to work their way back. We've seen Josh Allen 16 of 29, 180 yards passing in this one. James Cook just has the 9 attempts for 39 yards on the ground. Really struggling throughout the entire game in the air outside of the 52-yard completion to Khalid Shakir, which was pretty incredible from, throwing it over there at the right sideline, and one of those kind of improbable completions that, he seems to be able to make, that being Josh Allen. I did see a stat, Shawn, that particular play throughout Allen's career, so since 2018, he is 6 of 7 for 118 yards and 3 touchdowns on passes within a yard off the sideline. The rest of the NFL is 1 for 16 on completions. So that is a skill set that we see there from Allen, but it was nowhere near enough on this day to overcome this Ravens offense. So what are some of your thoughts here? Is it just a case that when they're good, they're going to run over everybody? They're probably not going to be in a huge amount of pass-heavy game scripts, and, outside of the running backs and Lamar Jackson, the Ravens are almost unusable at this point. And I would even be like, you're looking at somebody who we have a lot of belief in the likes of Zay Flowers. Very hard to put him into those lineups on a weekly basis.
Yeah, I don't know if I would say that about Flowers, in part because you're going to have to start some people, especially as we go into the buys. But this was kind of the double-edged sword of the efficiency and the dominance that we expected from the Baltimore Ravens. We got a bit of that last year as well. I mean, this is a team that very consistently has been, the most run heavy in the NFL. There were
They've also been a team that has been able to beat the Chiefs or the Bills, but then when it gets to those playoff games have, struggled in those one-off situations where the game script goes against them. They're able to, they're kind of trying to build a team to be able to control those passing offenses off both of those teams when it gets to playoff times, but they've been able to do it during the season, but not in the postseason.
And some of that is just a little bit fluky. Some of it
Yeah.
is the fact that Lamar Jackson is going to struggle with accuracy and completion percentage at times, and especially in big games, not because the game is big, but because in many cases, those are elite defenses that you're playing against, and the margins are small enough that when you make mistakes, the mistakes are amplified. I do think there's plenty of room for enthusiasm here, in that this group of skill position players is probably the best that he's played with. So you think about where they are right now with Derrick Henry and Justice Hill. One of the things that really jumps out is how good these guys are compared to other backfields that they have had. It's one of the interesting things about the Titans deciding to go away from Henry and to someone who is a huge step back in Tony Pollard. It's a situation where when you think about Derrick Henry versus Gus Edwards and what that means in terms of what the Ravens are able to do. And then Justice Hill has been a longtime favorite of RotoViz, of the show. He struggled to stay healthy. I mean, this is more what we thought he could do if he was healthy and operating in the context of this type of offense. Now, he's not going to go out and do this every day, but it wasn't just that he was involved in this game. He looks like the best receiving back in the NFL right now. And so when you put those two things together, it's just so disheartening, as you kind of mentioned, to only get the 18 passing plays. But then the only two guys who were involved in the receiving game for the Ravens are the running backs.
Yeah.
One of the things I wrote about a couple weeks ago was that if the Ravens continued to pass a lot, you were obviously going to get some type of bounce back from Mark Andrews. But the likelihood was that the first two games were a mirage in terms of how much that they passed. And Andrews was heading into a portion of the schedule where the strength of schedule streamer gave him incredibly tough matchups, the tight end position, incredibly tough matchups. One of the things for the Ravens specifically, one of the things is, some nuance in terms of how you look at Likely and Andrews not playing exactly the same role. But I mean, both of these guys have been completely and totally stopped. And so you think about those games that happened before the final drafts on Friday and Saturday. And again, these things are easy to say when you look back and you're mostly getting it right. But Likely was the one guy I thought you probably couldn't really bank the points because you're going to pay a lot for them, and then you weren't going to get that much the rest of the season. Now, there was certainly a scenario where that turned out not to be the case, where he actually was pretty dynamic going forward. But you look at this team, and it seems fairly clear-cut that they're going to be able to do something similar to this most of the rest of the way. On the flip side, I mean, the Bills are going to be good, right? You have Josh Allen, you probably have a pretty good defense, and yet you look at their early three games and how good they looked during those games, and it's pretty easy to say right now, well, the Arizona Cardinals are actually just not good. They were humiliated by essentially just Jayden Daniels yesterday, right? You look at the Miami Dolphins, they were shutting them down before the Tua injury, but then you get a decent chunk of this game after the Tua injury. They blow them out. The Dolphins, at least right now, are not particularly good. And then the Jacksonville Jaguars are absolutely awful. And so schedule strength may have made them look a little bit better than they are. They still have a lot of work to do to figure out what they're going to be on offense. James Cook, has a superficially solid per play game, but was mostly swallowed up in this one. Didn't look like a difference maker against the Ravens. And then you look at the receivers, and Shakir doesn't do much of anything other than that spectacular play that you mentioned. Keon Coleman has a bad drop, but is a little bit more involved. He's someone you probably want to get out there and pick up.
He had two nice sideline catches, in particular.
And you can see that combination of size and athleticism that was so appealing to them when they made that draft pick. You could also see some of the reasons that he underperformed in his final season and probably deserved to be more of a mid-third round pick. And then in this game, you finally got the 7 targets for Dalton Kincaid. He looked pretty involved. One of the things that still makes me nervous is you are getting the peripheral guys out there a lot who don't add anything. In a week like the previous week, where you win 47-10, then having this very dispersed offense and having everybody involved and having a bunch of guys who shouldn't be on an NFL field playing and looking good, you have all these positive vibes and you're like, oh, this will work fine. We don't need stars. We're better off without Stephon Diggs. You look at the game this week and you're like, well, does Curtis Samuel really have a role? Should he be on an NFL field? Why does Mac Hollins get 6 targets? Why is Marquez Valdez-Scantling suited up? Why is Dawson Knox drawing a single target? I mean, maybe Dawson Knox brings something in terms of tactical flexibility and blocking, what have you, but you really want to see this team evolve to where Shakir and Coleman and Kincaid are the obvious focal points. And I think that they would make the argument that that is what was kind of happening in this game. Certainly all 3 of those guys go for 45 plus. No one else even goes for 10 yards. But if those other guys aren't going to contribute, again, you just need to be very concentrated on the players who could eventually be the guy for you, or the guys, right? You have this 3-person group along with a James Cook, and maybe this offense ends up being pretty dynamic. I think you can probably mostly just write this game off for the Bills, but it certainly does raise some eyebrows.
Yeah, some of these games, I think it also highlights, that week-to-week element of, maybe the coaches thought something going in was going to work. The game plan just, did not work. You were completely wrong in that situation. We do see that sometimes where we see shifts in how teams look and, week-to-week basis. I think the Bills will be fine. You mentioned, though, the strength of schedule. One thing I was going to highlight, you also mentioned Kyler Murray. The Cardinals, I thought, were atrocious this week. Obviously, they didn't have Trey McBride. I don't think that's the sole reason for how bad they looked. I think Kyler has looked pretty dreadful all season, outside of one game where he starts off pretty hot and gets Marvin Harrison those touchdowns. He has 16 of 22 in this for 142 yards, 1 touchdown, 4 sacks over 27 yards. The reason I was going to highlight this game, more so that I think Kyler's really, really struggling. It also highlighted, having his former head coach as the offensive coordinator now of the Washington Commanders, and how much the 2 offenses look drastically different, and the efficiency of both sides and how things are looking at the moment. I thought Daniels looked great again, obviously very efficient in his passing, 26 of 30, 1 passing touchdown, 1 interception in this one for him. Brian Robinson, Shawn's looking really good over the last couple of weeks. There was no Austin Eckler in this game through concussion. We get Jeremy McNichols, 8 for 68 and 2 touchdowns, but one of those is 27-yard rushing touchdown, Shawn. And some of the tackling on this from the Arizona Cardinals, I do not even know how to describe it as to how bad some of the tackling was this week from some of the defensive backs. But we're seeing Daniels do this with, a lot of players who, similar situation to maybe what we were talking with the Texans last year in terms of Zacchaeus is the leading receiver here, 6 receptions for 85. We got McLaurin 7 for 52 and a touchdown. There's not a huge amount happening in the passing game. The reason, though, I'm highlighting this is not to speak about how great Jayden Daniels is. Again, you mentioned strength of schedule. The game so far that we have seen for Jayden Daniels, he has faced Cincinnati, New York Giants, and Arizona Cardinals over the last 3 weeks. 3 of potentially the worst defenses in the entire NFL, outside of maybe the Carolina Panthers getting themselves in there as well. He has also gone and, his start to the NFL to have one of the most successful completion percentages in NFL history. So we're looking at a situation where he's had 106 pass attempts. He's completed 87 of them for 82.1% completion, but he's also doing it against poor defenses. Is there any part of you at the moment that is thinking strength schedule here with Jayden Daniels, or is it just a case that, like we said last week, that he is just going to be this good?
Well, I think that he's this good, and that's the big takeaway. And one of the things we were saying on Stealing Bananas is that he's pretty clearly the Dynasty 101.
Mm-hmm.
And I think you could already make the case that he should be, if you're doing a resurrection draft column, you and I may do a new guillotine draft with the listeners this week, that he should be the first quarterback drafted. Having said that, I do think you're going to run into some teams on the schedule that aren't going to let Brian Robinson run free like this. That'll put more pressure back on the passing game. You're going to run into some weeks where really only having Terry McLaurin as a viable NFL receiver on your roster is going to cause you some problems. His brilliance and the incompetency of other teams is covering up what is still a pretty hollowed out roster for the Washington Commanders. This is a 3-1 team that top to bottom is almost certainly in the bottom 25% in overall talent. So your QB is going to carry you a long way if you have the best QB. Beyond even just the fact that Brian Robinson is going to run for every week, you have poor wide receivers. There are going to be some teams that figure out how to stop the things that Jayden Daniels is doing. The teams like to come out and say, oh, well, they're just, they're running a college offense. And the Commander's like, well, you don't seem to have the answers for college offenses, right? We are going to see some answers. He's going to be required to do some other things, but at this point, there's no reason to believe he won't be able to meet those challenges when they come.
I would agree, Shawn. I think that it's just interesting, when you think through it and how, we can get moving down one, not rabbit hole, but one direction, and just things can, as we mentioned, change on a week-to-week basis. But an amazing start to a rookie campaign for a rookie quarterback. Really, I would have to imagine the Commanders fans out there are absolutely revigorated by how the offense is looking at the moment. Shawn, we talked last week about Jordan Love a little bit, and I mentioned that maybe it seems overly enthusiastic, to want to push him into that top tier of quarterback from a dynasty perspective. But while the Packers struggled immensely to start this one off, they get into a 28-0 hole. They get a touchdown just before halftime. Then the Vikings in this game do not score again until they get a field goal in the third quarter, and which was a kind of bizarre game from that perspective. The offensive success early for the Vikings, and then the Packers, having a lot of offensive success, but also not getting into the end zone on a couple of different occasions. But we do have Jordan Love, 389 yards, 4 touchdowns, 3 interceptions. Those interceptions, I'm the first person to say, is not all on his back in terms of how they came about. We do get Jayden Reed 7 for 139 on 8 targets, 1 touchdown for him. Dontavian Wicks, Shawn, who could have even had a bigger day. He did have a 4th down touchdown pass that he dropped that he really should have completed earlier than the comeback kind of came in and came about. We do have him having 5 for 78 and 2 touchdowns on 13 targets going his way, but he was really fighting some of these catches. Even the first touchdown catch that he had, it felt like it took a lot of work to catch on an open play. The other thing I want to highlight here, Shawn, is we get Tucker Kraft 9 targets to Luke Musgrave's 3 targets. Kraft getting the touchdown. He also gets a 2-point conversion, 6 for 53 to Musgrave's 3 for 13. I mentioned, throughout the offseason, I was very much on the Musgrave side of this. I'm ready to receive that L on the tight end battle there. It does feel like Tucker Kraft is certainly leading the way at this moment in time. Christian Watson gets 1 target, gets hurt on that. That leads to 1 of the interceptions. He has been, it looks like a high ankle sprain. Obviously, it could be multiple weeks, so he may go on the short-term IR with that one. Disappointing for him after having stayed healthy so far through the hamstring issues, picks up that high ankle sprain. Shawn, on the Vikings side, they start off really, really strong. We get Jefferson in the end zone. We get Addison in the end zone twice in the first half. Aaron Jones looks great. Sam Darnold has 3 touchdowns to 1 interception, looking strong. I thought it was quite unusual the way this game, in terms of overall, starts off. We get a touchdown straight off the bat for the Vikings. We get the Packers missing a field goal. One of my other notes, and I've mentioned this to my wife watching games, and she has no interest in what happens in the outcome, but the Packers kicking situation is terrible. We can't just need to have a switch over there. But we have touchdown from that missed field goal. We have an interception for the Packers after that, followed up by a touchdown. So 3 touchdown drives in a row for the Vikings. Then the Packers miss another field goal. Then the Vikings punt. The Packers have an interception into another touchdown for the Vikings. So the Packers at this point is in dire straits. They turn the ball over on downs. Then they do get the touchdown before the end of the half. But in the second half, the Packers punt. It's an interception for the Vikings. Packers punt for the Vikings. Packers turned over and downs. It's a punt for the Vikings. The Packers get a touchdown. It's a fumble for the Vikings. Touchdown for the Packers. Field goal for the Vikings. Interception for the Packers. Punt, fumble, downs, touchdown, end of game. This game, Shawn, was bizarre in terms of how it was playing out, how plays were going. But the Vikings start off with that interception at they're all short drives coming out of the half, and the game could have turned around much quicker than it did. And if the Packers hadn't have missed those field goals, it would have been a different perspective. So I thought it was an interesting game. Looking at it though, Shawn, any keynotes that you're taking away from it? One of my things that I've mentioned a number of times with the Packers last season as they come out the gates last year. They're trying some of these deeper passes. They're missing them by small amounts. The completions aren't happening. There's some drops. I know it was only 2 weeks that Jordan Love was out, but there was some timing issues I felt with the Packers in those opening 2 quarters, and they continued to push the ball deep throughout that second half. We get a 42-yard completion to Reed. We get 36 yards to Wicks, 21 to Kraft, 28 to Bo Melton. So they are pushing the ball down the field, and that's something that a lot of other teams are not doing. And we talked last week about how the Vikings struggle against, or how the Texans struggle against the Vikings. The Packers in that second half seem to have very little issue moving the ball against this Vikings team. And I think that's more the strength for the Packers moving forward from a fantasy perspective than it is for, the Vikings struggling defensively. I think although the Packers are 0-2 with Jordan Love and 2-0 with Malik Willis, I think the offense is set up here to have a lot of fantasy production moving forward. And Jayden Reed, I think looking at dynasty rankings or looking at resurrection or redraft rankings as the season goes on, Jayden Reed with Jordan Love, the efficiency that those two guys have together and the point scoring totals that Reed is putting up is fantastic to see for a second-year player here.
I do think the game script had a lot to do with this game and sort of the fluky nature of some of the turnovers. I mean, some fluky, some not. The aggressive nature of some of the passes that Jordan Love threw are going to give you some of those turnovers. But this is a game where both teams had 15 possessions. The Packers had 74 plays. The Vikings had 64. The Packers averaged a half yard more per play. Some of that is simply the decisions you're making on run-pass balance. The Vikings averaged almost a yard and a half more, a little bit more than a yard and a half more per pass attempt. It's fascinating here when you think about what might have happened if those field goals are made. Now, one of the things that you sort of like from a fantasy perspective is when you miss those field goals, the team has to be more aggressive. But when you miss those couple of kicks and then they go for it on a pretty difficult 4th and 10 in Vikings territory, trailing 28-0, where that would be a 51-yard field goal.
Yeah, they're not scoring that shot. This kicker is not putting those over.
Well, I mean, the problem he's had is a little bit directional. He's got a big leg, right? So I think that I would agree the Packers probably are going to have to address the kicking position. But if you add a third field goal there, it changes the game pretty dramatically once the Packers start to get after it and actually score. They're able to put some pressure on Sam Darnold, force a couple of mistakes from him. We know from his background track record that mistakes are something that Sam Darnold would make. You can't simply ignore everything that he's done in the past and say, oh, he looks completely different in this Minnesota Vikings passing attack. He's doing a lot of good things. He's averaging a lot of yards per pass. You don't still necessarily get the impression that he's going to go out and thrive in a very high volume passing attack. You'd really like to see the yardage for him along with the touchdowns. You'd love to see some games going forward where the Vikings trail and they have to really unlock Justin Jefferson and Jordan Addison. I think that part would be fun. But this is a game where the Packers throw 54 times. You only get the 17 rush attempts for Josh Jacobs and Emmanuel Wilson combined. In games where the Packers are in control, you're probably not going to get anything like what we got on Sunday. And yet, the Packers defense is poor. So this is a team, unlike some of the other situations where we like the quarterback play, maybe where we like a receiver, where you could get some pretty consistent shootout opportunities. And if you do, I mean, Jordan Love's playmaking ability is almost unparalleled at this point. Jayden Reed looks like a guy who, it's still premature to say anything about putting him up in that CeeDee Lamb or Justin Jefferson type of category, but he continues to rise. The combination of things that he brings to the table, again, as we've talked about all along, the before and after the catch, both extremely dynamic. He's going to be very, very productive in Dontavian Wicks. I mean, sadly, I think the team is probably better when Christian Watson is out. And certainly we're not rooting for that to happen. In this case, where it simply has happened, I think you have to like what it unlocks. I mean, even from the perspective of if Tucker Kraft doesn't fumble down the stretch on a play where you just simply can't make that mistake, this Packers team is really exciting. They're 2-2 now. They're going to end up, I'm guessing with 5 or 6 losses and in fantastic position again for the playoffs. The NFC playoffs should be pretty exciting. I'm fired up about it, as you can probably tell, Colm. At this point, and this is kind of similar to the discussion we had last week, I mean, who would you rather have than Jordan Love at quarterback for your fantasy team?
Me? Maybe Jayden Daniels. I think he's right at the top of the list. I think the way that you mentioned the aggressiveness, leading to interceptions. I think the Packers are quite aggressive, even in neutral situations, based on how they try and scheme up plays off the other plays that they have, run previously, maybe in the game, having some different looks. But Shawn, there's a couple of games I want to try and squeeze in before we get through today's games. One of the players that I did have linking it into the Packers game, I had a league where I thought this week I'm going to start Xavier Legette. And right before lock, I swapped him in for Christian Watson. So this didn't work out for me, but the Bengals get back on track as we kind of thought they would do against the Carolina Panthers. Panthers defense really struggling. Andy Dalton, the quarterback, again, 2 touchdowns, 1 interception for him. One of those touchdowns going to Xavier Legette, the other one going to Deontay Johnson. Johnson's fantasy season and season in general been really revived since we get Dalton in there. He goes 7 for 83 and a touchdown on 13 targets. We get Legette, 10 targets, 6 receptions, 66 yards, and a touchdown for him. So nice to see the rookie getting involved. There's not a huge amount in the passing game outside of those 2 guys. Chuba Hubbard's looking really good, Shawn, over the last couple of games. He has a long of 38 yards in this one. He goes 18 for 104 and a touchdown for him. Legette also had 10 yards rushing on 2 attempts. But on the other side, I think Chase Brown, Zach Moss has been something we've talked about in recent weeks. We were obviously known to be on the Chase Brown side of it. We had some back and forth battles on Sunday morning, not battles, but between leagues. We have Chase Brown in a lot of leagues, and we're like, in this league, we kind of just want a couple of points, safe margins to try and get the result. And the main event, Shawn, was one where we felt like, you want to go and try and hit the hammer. And he had a game here against the Panthers, gets 2 touchdowns, gets into the end zone twice, and then you get the 15 carries for 80 yards. You get 15 carries for Moss for 51 yards. In the passing game, we still get 1 additional target for Moss. He goes 4 for 27 and a touchdown. We get Chase Brown, 3 targets, 2 receptions, 18 yards. Overall, throughout the game, I think looking at what happened, Legette obviously getting some rookie performance, but the Chase Brown, Zach Moss, is it back to 50-50 and we possibly start to see Brown get worked in? Maybe it was a case that Brown wasn't 100% healthy starting the year.
I honestly have no idea what it was the case of. And I still don't. I'm so biased that it's hard to give a fair answer on this question or even pose some of the other questions kind of back to you in a way that's fair. But outside of Derrick Henry, who was easily the story of week 4 at the running back position, when you think forward, when you think about what happened this week, and then you think forward, who is more explosive when he takes the handoff than Chase Brown? And it's not just week 4, right? I mean, they've barely played him, and yet every time he has the ball in his hands, you're thinking, be careful, because, and Bucky has been very fun. Bucky a little bit different in that he has that wiggle. Bucky's just unbelievably cool. He was fantastic again in week 4. But Chase Brown, we know that one of the things that you can point to if you're a fan is that on his long score last year, it was the 2nd fastest time for a ball carrier in the 2023 season. The question is, how do you translate that to consistent performance? How do you look at his final season in college where he was a massive workhorse but wasn't particularly efficient? And one of the things that I've noted from time to time is that Blair has done a lot of work on that and demonstrated that it was almost certainly team situation that caused the lack of efficiency. Now, even in that context, you would prefer to have gotten the types of big plays from him that you would expect against college players that would balance some of that out. But Colm, you watch this game and he absolutely flies every time he touches the ball. I have no idea what the Bengals are doing. I mean, I wrote it up last week in the Zero RB universe that the Bengals just wanted to lose as many games as possible. They finally have a game here against the Carolina Panthers where they're like, we're 0-3. It's probably time to start playing.
Yeah, we should get a win there.
If we lose to the Panthers, it's going to be embarrassing. People are going to say even worse things about us on the podcasts and talk shows and what have you. Maybe we should get our good players involved. And, part of what you have happening here, even though it ends up being a very bland performance once you consider the volume he got, but in a must-win, you get 10 targets for T. Higgins. Now, part of that's just that he's back and available on the field, and you get the 15 carries for Chase Brown. I mean, my concern here is that he did appear to make a couple of mistakes in this game. And from the perspective of lining up, what have you, that kind of thing is always going to grate on the coaching staff. Zach Moss was bad as a runner, but made some plays in the receiving game. One of the things that was talked up a lot this offseason was how much work Chase Brown had done as a receiver. And certainly if you get him the ball in space as compared to Zach Moss, you would probably get or potentially get some big plays. The fact that the workload is pretty even between the two, and Moss wasn't awful in this one as he has been in some games. Is the full takeover in effect? I mean, I'm still very nervous. You look at the 2 touchdowns that Chase Brown scored, and there's an element of happenstance to them in terms of just who was on the field at the time. Yeah. Certainly, I don't think that we would say, he's going to be the goal line back or he's going to score all the touchdowns. For Chase Brown to do what we want, he simply has to play more. And so he played more in this game. It ended up very favorably, and he got the 2 touchdowns. Still very nervous going forward, but extremely excited because he just looks so good. And the other little element here is that because they were so bad the first 3 weeks, the Bengals didn't necessarily create a very large pie for the running backs. I do think this has the potential to be sort of a medium large pie offense to the backs. That would help balance out workload issues or market share issues of touches for Brown if simply the Bengals are more like this. But again, you're not going to play the Carolina Panthers every week.
Yeah, that's very true. So we'll see what happens moving forward, but a big step in the positive direction with Chase Brown in this one. Shawn, I want to put 2 games together, and I'm going to let you take the direction that you want to go with it. But one of the games that a few people reached out to me in the DMs this morning was the Raiders and the Browns. And I do want to mention when I reached out about the DMs, I had somebody reached out that had traveled, Shawn, from Iceland. They were in Dublin this weekend. They were looking for somewhere to watch the games. Now, I didn't see the message to the games that started, but thankfully the hotel bar came through for him. But he is a RotoViz OT listener, Shawn, from Iceland in Ireland watching the NFL. So again, it's always cool to see how the game grows and how the podcast and the conversations in the community happens, which is always awesome. But one of the things people were reaching out about, Shawn, was Brock Bowers. Watching this game, the commentary are talking about, we met with the quarterback, we met with Gardner Minshew, we met with the head coach. All as they can talk about is, Brock Bowers, and he doesn't even need to know the play. Like, you just tell him and he'll get out there and he knows exactly what to do every time. It's so natural to him. And I'm like, we're in the 4th quarter, and like, why are they telling you all this if, we're going to get him 3 targets, get him 2 for 19? I think that the Raiders offense here is it's really struggling. I think that's pretty obvious. But this game, Shawn, and the way Minshew was playing and the way the game was being called, they actually got me actively rooting for Deshaun Watson and the Browns to win this game. This got me into, like, I was in, tilt mode, like some of the Arthur Smith play calling games last year where I was rooting against the Falcons. So we get the Browns losing this one. Amari Cooper does have a 82-yard touchdown called back, and what I believe is a phantom holding call. We've seen a few of them this week. We won't get to the Atlanta Falcons game, but there was kind of something of similar nature for a Bijan Robinson touchdown that got called back. But Bowers' usage is something, obviously, that's disappointing to see. Still, obviously, huge belief in the talent. We're 4 weeks into his rookie season. I think we're going to see that all step forward. But I do think that the Minshew Mania stuff, even though they get the win here, could start to fall off the rails. And I can't say for sure Aidan O'Connell is going to do a better job here, but offensively, they're a little bit inept at the moment. They're kind of playing to their opponent's level, like the Cleveland Browns here, rather than really trying to do anything innovative. But the other game, Shawn, that I thought was interesting was the Colts and the Steelers. Somebody we talked a lot about in the offseason, and it kind of has worked out, fortunately for us, based on it looked like Russell Wilson will be the starter, but then he misses week 1 with an injury. We have now the Pittsburgh Steelers at 3-1. Justin Fields does lose in this game, but he's 312 passing yards. He has 1 passing touchdown. He does take 4 sacks for 30 yards. Some, again, questionable decisions in terms of when he's taken those sacks. And one of them, which wouldn't have counted as a sack, was kind of he slipped and he fumbled the ball himself after a deep move back in terms of territory. He also goes 10 for 55 and 2 rushing touchdowns. George Pickens has some very impressive plays in this: 11 targets, 7 receptions, 113 yards for him. Pat Freiermuth caught the touchdown. He gets into the end zone. Pickens had a bad fumble himself in this one, where he's down at the sideline holding the ball with one hand, and it kind of slips out by himself. It's recovered by the Colts. The other real talking point, Shawn, is Anthony Richardson does get hurt again. He goes out in the first quarter, misses the rest of the game. He was 3 of 4 for 71 yards when he goes out. Joe Flacco comes in. He goes 16 of 26 for 2 touchdowns, 168 yards. Richardson was off to a nice start, 3 for 24, but he goes out for a play. He comes back in, and the commentators in this one are saying there's no way they're going to, do a read option on this play, and that's exactly what they do. He goes out, he gets hit again, he goes to the sideline, he goes to the locker room, he's out for the rest of the game. Thankfully, it seems like it may not be serious long-term injury. Sounds like he will be kind of on a week-to-week basis, so hopefully he will be back soon. But I thought it was kind of not the smartest coaching decision and play call to do that to somebody who's already had a number of injuries in his short career. Jonathan Taylor, again, looked good, 21 for 88 and a touchdown for him, 3 for 20 through the air, but he gets hurt in this. We'll see what the reports are as we move forward with Taylor's status entering week 5. You mentioned as well, Shawn, the bye week starting to come in here. So there's going to be a lot of teams that where you've built out a roster, this is where you'll start to really see how the depth is setting up. Went through a lot there, Shawn. The Brock Bowers stuff probably almost speaks for itself. My rant may have covered a lot of it, but Justin Fields, any takeaways on his performance here? And even though it's a losing effort, some of the highest fantasy production we've seen from him this season, we've seen him get a little bit more out there in a rushing situation where they're coming from behind and they're trying to get back to win this one. He does go for 32 total fantasy points in week 4 so far as we enter Monday Night Football, the QB1 on the week.
Yeah, in the defense of the Raiders, which I don't know that there really is any, but Bowers is wide open early.
Oh, he has one bad drop, yeah. But that's not a reason to just go away from.
Well, no, it's not a reason.
It's going to go for a first down.
Yeah, it's going to go for probably 30 yards.
Yeah, 30 yards because he catches it after 10 yards, and then he's good enough to get another 20 yards after the catch.
There's just no one anywhere close to him. And so, you've got to catch it. That's a 4.5 point play for a tight end in tight end premium. And lots of people are going to lose by 4.5 points.
And what can we say about like Jacoby Myers getting 10 targets with 5 receptions? Keep going back to him as much as possible.
Well, one of the things that was odd in this game is that you don't have Devontae Adams. You do have Brock Bowers coming wide open pretty consistently, but the ball is already out on low percentage prayer passes.
He wasn't the first look on any of these plays.
Yeah, so you're throwing the ball up to guys who are backup type of receivers, and you get the results that you would expect to get from that, which is that Gardner Minshew completes 14 passes for 130 yards and no touchdowns. The Raiders are a weird team because they have defeated the Baltimore Ravens, but your guess is that they're one of the worst teams in football and probably the only team, not the only team. I mean, the Jacksonville Jaguars would be in the mix. Certainly there are some other bad teams, but it's almost hard to fathom just how bad the Cleveland Browns are right now. And I mean, they kind of made their own bed with the Deshaun Watson situation. Brock Bowers took an end around. I mean, he's going to be an absolute superstar. It's just really frustrating if you needed the points this week when they don't have Devontae Adams for him to not really be in the game plan. I do think they had to make the move to Aiden O'Connell, and I do think that they have to sit down and figure out like how they're going to be decent on offense, because winning like this is just a massive fluke. It's not sustainable against any team that is okay, and you're going to play. And the Denver Broncos are actually a very interesting squad at this point. They're far better than the Raiders. The Chargers are an interesting squad. They're far better than the Raiders. The Chiefs are actually having a terrible time, but are somehow undefeated, but again, far better than the Raiders. If you want to be an interesting competitive team and not everybody get fired, then you're going to have to improve what you're doing. It's pretty embarrassing right now on the offensive side for Las Vegas. I think that you could make some of those same comments about the Pittsburgh Steelers, who have this weapon in Justin Fields. They don't really take advantage of him until you're in deep comeback mode in the second half. Everything that you know about Justin Fields was on display in this game. The ability to make throws that only a few other quarterbacks could make, the ability to create rushing value and rushing plays that only a few other quarterbacks can make. You also do get the mistakes that you mentioned. I think that you kind of have to lean into that. Now, there's a huge 32-yard gain for Najee Harris as a receiver in this one. But, I mean, we're right back to the point where, Najee Harris is not even a quality backup as a pure runner. Cordero Patterson looked pretty good. Then he was injured. They desperately miss Jaylen Warren. There's a mix of incentives and beliefs, again, where you have Arthur Smith. That's probably not ideal. You have a team that wants to be defensively oriented. That's not going to be ideal for Justin Fields' fantasy value. And then you have a quarterback who can do all of these dynamic things, and you want him to be a game manager. Again, all of that is a little bit tricky, but it's fun to see the big performance from Fields in this one. I guess I would just close out by saying, I understand what the commentators were saying. I understand what you're saying, but the value of Anthony Richardson is that he's a gigantic human being who is freakishly athletic, and you could potentially use as a bit of a battering ram. You can use that athleticism. The problem comes in that unlike a few of the other guys, like a Josh Allen, for example, who has managed to do all of these things and stay healthy, Anthony Richardson has not been able to. I don't think that he has any value unless he's being used on those types of plays. And if he's hurt, then he probably just needs to leave the game anyway. So in some ways, they get a test of how healthy he is. The answer is not healthy enough. You go to Joe Flacco. Flacco did struggle in this game. He unlocks the receivers to an extent because they're probably not going to get the volume that they get with Anthony Richardson, even though Richardson had already uncorked some of his best passes of the entire season. The Colts are, again, in a little bit of a weird spot where you could make the argument that when they're healthy, the Colts have some of the best skill position players in all of football, and yet the quarterback situation is weird. Their defense is both bad and now heavily injured. This is a game, I would say, that even though it was on the road, the Pittsburgh Steelers, if they want to be in the mix in the AFC, they absolutely have to win. They do not.
Yeah, they did not. And we'll see. I mentioned a few of the injury statuses there. We'll see what it does moving forward. I would have to assume that Fields is going to be the quarterback entering week 5. But of course, Tomlin has said that he hasn't made a definitive decision on that one. But that is going to do it for this edition of RotoViz OT. We will be back for the Wednesday edition. We'll have a Friday one coming up. Shawn mentioned we may be doing the guillotine draft. I know a lot of people jumped into the first one. If you're interested in drafting against myself and Shawn in the next one, possibly even this week, reach out, let me know on Twitter at OvertimeIreland or email across at overtimeireland@gmail.com. My name is Colm Kelly. You can follow me on Twitter at OvertimeIreland, as I mentioned. You can find all of Shawn's work up on rotoviz.com. And until we are back, have a good one.